Good afternoon. We'll be getting started in just a moment here, waiting for folks to join us this afternoon or this morning. All right, thank you all for joining us today. I know it's a crazy busy time with the run up to the holidays. We so appreciate all of you who are joining us live today. And we know that more of you will be watching this recording in the weeks to come. So we appreciate you, whether you are here live and in person or whether you're watching this at a future date. I'm Amanda Berkson-Chilcock. I'm a senior fellow here at National Skills Coalition. And I'm delighted to be here with you for, I think, a whirlwind, but hopefully pretty substantive and meaty 30-minute webinar, taking you through some high points about the new federal investment in digital skills and digital equity that we saw as part of the recently passed infrastructure bill. So I want to just briefly introduce you to my amazing colleague, Caroline Trishita. And Caroline is joining us today from Washington, D.C., where NSC is based. And she is an integral member of our government affairs team and works closely with policymakers on the Hill and in federal agencies. So she'll be leading the first part of our conversation, then I'll pop in towards the end to sort of draw some connections to our state level work. I want to give a special shout out to our many partners from the digital inclusion world who are joining us perhaps for the first time. National Skills Coalition is a broad-based coalition of advocates from across the workforce, adult education, and higher education fields. We are delighted to have all of you. I know there are also federal agency folks joining us today, and we hope you'll find this information really useful. And really, this is step one of what we anticipate in 2022 will be a whole host of resources that we'll be sharing with the field as the implementation of this really notable investment moves forward. So let me hand things over without further ado to Caroline.
Hi, everyone. So first, just want to start off the webinar with a big thank you. Many of you on this call have helped National Skills Coalition develop a shared vision of what inclusive digital equity looks like for all workers and across businesses. We received input on these principles from a variety of people in our network, including our national advisory panel, our state network leads, who we call our skill span leads, our Business Leaders United network, and members of our industry recovery panels, who are a group of more than 60 national workforce stakeholders from retail and hospitality, infrastructure, manufacturing, and healthcare sectors that created a set of recommendations for the Biden administration on federal recovery policies. So this was really a collective strategy, and we can't thank you enough for your valuable input. And thank you to all those members in our network who helped us develop the 5 principles that are a national policy strategy for digital equity at work. Those principles were on the last slide, which we'll just go over quickly. The first one is high quality hardware in all hands, because we know how important the connection between access to personal devices and access to education, training, jobs, healthcare, support services, and more is. Next is every community connected, because broadband is a foundational utility, but unfortunately access to broadband is inequitable across communities. The third is a digital skill foundation for all, which is nearly 50 million people in the US need to build foundational digital skills to harness the power of connected devices. Every person must have the opportunity to develop broad-based, flexible digital problem-solving skills for current technologies and for future technological shifts. Fourth, we have upskilling for every worker in every workplace. We must empower every worker with industry and occupational specific digital skills to adapt and advance their careers. And finally, rapid reskilling for rapid reemployment. Each industry has specific technical demands, and every worker must have access to rapid reskilling to move from one industry to another. So those are our digital equity at work strategy principles. And now that we've taken a look at those, we'll take a look at our agenda for today's conversation. First, we'll review how Congress and the administration is responding to our digital equity strategy. We'll look at the work we've done as a coalition over the past year. We'll take a look at recent congressional action, what it means for our network of skills advocates, what more that federal policy makers need to do, and how we can continue advocating to make sure that policymakers continue to hear our voice about these important issues. So let's get into it. So first, Congress paid attention to you. National Skills Coalition with our network has led an extensive federal advocacy campaign on the importance of inclusive workforce development policies and funding, and that includes digital equity. Many of the people in this webinar have been a part of these advocacy efforts over the past year plus. It started with our Skills for an Inclusive Economic Recovery campaign at the end of last year, going into this year. We let Congress know that supporting workers and businesses was essential as we began the road to recovery from COVID. Then we held our virtual fly-in back in May to influence the president and Congress's infrastructure policies and let them know that there's no infrastructure plan without the funding and policies to support people entering skills training programs to obtain infrastructure jobs. Then we took to the Hill again this summer virtually to influence the physical infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better Act and ensure that workforce funding was a substantial part of the package and that workforce funding stayed a part of these packages when there was threats of cuts. And finally, in addition to all of these great virtual meetings, we've been sending advocacy messages up to Congress via emails and sign-on letters. And we know it's been a lot of work, but the work is paying off. As a reminder, or for new folks who weren't involved over the past year, here are some main asks of our advocacy campaigns for the past year. We asked for $100 billion in funding for workforce development, including money for digital skills and support services. We asked Congress to invest in small and mid-sized businesses that were hit hardest by the pandemic and empower them to create good training programs by investing in industry sector partnerships. And we had asked for an expansion to federal financial aid to short-term, high-quality training programs so more workers can enter into rapid reskilling programs. So now we'll look at how Congress responded to these asks. So we have the House passed version of the Build Back Better Act, which is the human and social spending policy component of the hard infrastructure bill. That includes a variety of policies like expanding the child tax credit and earned income tax credits, climate and environmental policies, and more. And then in terms of what NSC advocated for, it also included $40 billion for workforce training. And while that's not quite the $100 billion that we called for and that President Biden also proposed, it's still a considerable victory given the size and the scope of the overall package. It was a bit smaller than anticipated. And what's in that $40 billion investment is really important as well. One of the biggest pools of money within the $40 billion goes to industry sector partnerships funded at a proposed $5 billion. We know these partnerships are so important for getting workers trained for jobs within their communities and also allowing businesses to have access to a pool of hiring talent. We also see another $5 billion for grants between industry partnerships and community colleges administered out of the Department of Education. This has added capacity for community colleges to play that pivotal role in preparing workers for jobs created in the infrastructure package and that businesses are hiring for now. In the House passed version of Build Back Better, we also see plus ups to adult, youth, and dislocated worker titles of WIOA, new provisions to the Trade Adjustments Assistance Act, and additional workforce investments that will help those most impacted by the pandemic. And if you're interested in our full analysis of the bill, I would recommend watching our most recent episode of Skills on the Hill, which is on YouTube, which goes into a lot more detail about these proposals. And finally, while passing Build Back Better in the House with this amount of workforce funding is a really important signal, an important moment for our network, the Senate is still negotiating, and we appreciate you all staying plugged in as we work to get it over the finish line. So now we'll take a look at the digital equity provisions that Congress has moved on this year. Over the summer, the House passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which was the bipartisan hard infrastructure bill. The Senate, after much debate, passed it this November, and then the president quickly signed it into law. The good news is that this bill included investments in digital equity and digital skills that were quite consistent with the provisions that we just outlined that were essential to our digital equity campaign. So that includes $65 billion for broadband and devices. This includes dollars for important issues like rural connectivity, subsidizing the cost of internet for low-income families, and more. And these connect to both the first and second tenets of our campaign, which you'll remember are high quality hardware in all hands and every community connected. Also in this bill, historically, it included $2.75 billion for grants that are consistent with the Digital Equity Act, which puts a strong emphasis on digital skills and digital equity and connects to our third principle of our campaign, a digital skill foundation for all. Because as we know, every person must have the opportunity to develop these flexible digital problem solving skills for both current technologies and future technological shifts. So now we'll dig into the Digital Equity Act a bit more. As mentioned, it totals at $2.75 billion over 5 years in grant funding. For perspective, WIOA titles 1 and 2 are currently funded at just over $3 billion per year. So this is a really big and historic investment. The legislation was co-sponsored by Senator Murray, Democrat from Washington. She's chair of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. And Senator Rob Portman, a Republican from Ohio, a longtime supporter of NSC and skills champion. And also Senator Angus King, an independent from Maine, so a true bipartisan bill. And I'll just add that this part of IIJA is really historic because previously in Congress, we've seen efforts to expand access to broadband and devices, which are two important parts of digital equity, but equally important is ensuring that workers have access to digital skills so they can train for jobs and get hired for jobs and even upskill when they're on the job. So this is definitely an important step at the federal level in recognizing the skills component of digital inclusion. So the $2.75 billion in grants I mentioned, that breaks down into 3 different types. The first is a planning grant. This grant is meant to ensure states have the capacity to promote the achievement of digital equity and to support digital inclusion activities. The next type is formula funding. So governors will select administering entities within their state to develop, implement, and oversee the state digital equity plan. These can then be broken out into subgrants in support of the plan and are used to carry out, again, digital inclusion activities and to advocate for digital equity. And then the additional third type of grant is a competitive grant funded at $1.25 billion over 5 years. The purpose of these competitive grants is to support efforts to achieve digital equity, promote digital inclusion activities, and can also be used to spur greater adoption of broadband among covered populations. We've got a list of entities that are eligible to apply on this slide. Hopefully you see either yourself or a close partner on this list. I also want to note that these competitive grants may not go to entities that serve the administering entity for the state capacity grant. So it has to be one or the other. And finally, just want to emphasize again that this is not a formula grant program for all states. So you will have to apply for the competitive grants. So who's in charge? What's next? The Digital Equity Act will be rolling out through the Commerce Department's National Telecommunications and Information Administration, the NTIA. They are staffing up now and looking for people with experience in the digital equity field. So you may want to consider applying. And they will issue requests for information and comments and notices of funding opportunities soon. So now is the time to start getting ready to provide input. And We hope you use this as an opportunity to further some of your digital skills goals for your workforce and your community. So back over to you, Amanda.
Caroline, that was a lot of information, but presented in a way that hopefully folks were really able to absorb it. And again, the good news is you'll all be getting the slides and recording following this webinar, so you can refer back to it and share with colleagues. So I'm going to go into a little more depth about some kind of practical next steps. What are the immediate implications for you as an adult educator, a workforce leader, a state or federal official, a digital inclusion practitioner? You absolutely should start now. I know it feels tempting to wait until more things roll out from the federal government, but this is a great time to get started laying the groundwork so that your state can really hit the ground running. There are key national partners that can really help you make your voice heard in this conversation. Many of you are on the call today, but some you may not be connected with yet or maybe less familiar with. So I've listed a few key partners on this slide here, and I encourage you to connect with our peers and colleagues at these organizations as that is appropriate for you going forward. So what does this really look like? Caroline mentioned that every governor will be appointing an administering entity to oversee the digital equity plan process. There's a lot of factors that go into choosing which state agency or other eligible entity would be the right one to administer this plan. And I encourage you to take a look at the full text of the legislation, which is pretty short and pretty easy to read. The Digital Equity Act is just a small component of the large infrastructure bill. And we did link it on an earlier slide, so you can go back and take a look at your leisure. But really making sure that your governor has workforce and education agencies at the table from the very beginning is important. We don't know whether governors will appoint a state broadband office, whether they will appoint a state adult education agency or labor agency or other partner to lead this work. But we do know that it's really important that people with skills expertise are part of the decision-making from the beginning. And maybe there is a particular agency within your state that you'd really like to see take the lead on this. And your governor needs to be hearing from you about that as they're making this decision, right? There's a million different pots of federal money flowing down to the states right now through the various COVID relief bills, from the CARES Act to the American Rescue Plan to the infrastructure bill and on and on. There's a lot on your governor's plates right now. So if you have preferences and ideas, they should be hearing from you directly. If you aren't already well plugged in, you'll also want to plug in to your peers at the local level in the digital inclusion field. Digital inclusion includes all three legs of the stool, which is to say digital broadband access, device access, and skills. And you might want to connect with some of the local affiliates of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. I've included a link to their affiliate list on this slide. That's the orange link there. And NDIA also has a really useful state digital skills scorecard, which is a work in progress. They've added a lot to it already. They are interested in making more iterative changes. So if you take a look and you want to see more or different for your state, they're very open to hearing from you directly about that. Maybe you're already on top of these things, right? Maybe you've already been thinking about this for a few months, hoping that Congress was going to pass the Digital Equity Act, and you're just chomping at the bit, waiting to do more. So if you are, there is more you can do right now. So the first thing is, even if you think this is really obvious, make sure that your governor's office and your state officials are aware of digital skills work that your organization is already leading. You can take a look at National Skills Coalition's 10 state policy recommendations around digital skills. Maybe there will be some opportunities for your state to kind of take those and run with them under Digital Equity Act implementation. And even without waiting for the Federal Digital Equity Act planning process to get underway, you can learn from some innovative work that your partners around the country are doing. I've linked a really cool set of slides from Hawaii about their recent digital skills survey of state residents, which is just really bold and creative, and I think a great model for how states can be starting to think about these issues. There are also practical steps you can take at the federal level, right? You can connect with federal agencies. The National Telecommunications and Information Administration, or NTIA, has 6 public listening sessions scheduled in the next couple of months. And there are opportunities for members of the public to share their perspective on the Digital Equity Act, their hopes, their vision for how they'd like to see the federal agencies implement it. So please take advantage of that. There'll be a forthcoming request for comment coming out also from NTIA. That responding to that can really help shape the upcoming notices of funding opportunities. So Caroline talked about the formula funding that states will be getting and the competitive grant funding that a whole long list of eligible entities will be able to apply for. If you want to shape what those notices of funding opportunity, or what we often know in the nonprofit field as a request for proposal, if you want to shape what that looks like, you need to be responding to the request for comment. And you can stay on National Skills Coalition's mailing list, and you can stay on the National Digital Inclusion Alliance mailing list to know what's coming down the pike. And then if you're in contact with federal officials in other contexts, particularly the Department of Labor and the Employment Training Administration, or the Department of Education and the Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education, this is a great moment to be talking to your colleagues and partners there about possibilities for joint guidance or possibilities for joint webinars to really make sure that education and workforce leaders are working closely hand in glove with digital inclusion leaders as this funding gets rolled out. We need to do more to make NSC's 4th and 5th principles a reality. And just as a reminder, Caroline went over these early in the webinar, but upskilling for workers with industry-specific digital skills and reskilling for workers who might have lost a job and need to retrain with other industry-specific digital skills are really important. So we need to be reminding Congress of the need for investing in those skills. And NSC has publications that you can use to make that case, whether you're trying to talk to your governor's office, whether you're trying to talk to your mayor, your city council, or whether you're trying to talk to Congress. And I've listed several of those on the slide here. We have others that I can mention in the chat when we get to the Q&A. So I'm going to pass things back over to Caroline here for the last minute or two, and then we'll take a few questions before we wrap up. Caroline.
Great. So here we have what you can urge Congress to do, kind of the next steps that you can take. And so the first, explicitly seed digital skills throughout all major workforce development legislation. We have potentially an upcoming reauthorization of WIOA, and making sure digital skills are a part of that reauthorization will be really important. And then we're also going to need new additional investments in digital skills, especially industry-specific digital skills. And finally, of course, we are all urging Congress to pass the Build Back Better Act. The sooner the better, so that investments in digital equity are paired with investments in workforce development training. So we also have a few more steps here that you can take. If you haven't yet signed on to NSC's 5 principles for digital equity, please do so. If you're interested, the link is there. And again, we'll have the slide sent around after. And then, maybe take it a step further and also ask your partners, including businesses, to sign on too. Feel free to please contact your allies in state government to ensure that skills advocates are represented in digital equity planning conversations. We want to make sure that we have a seat at the table as these conversations take off. And finally, National Skills Coalition will be hosting our Skills Summit in Washington, D.C., February 15th through 17th. This is an opportunity to hear directly from federal leaders and also talk directly to your member of Congress. So we'll get those meetings set up for you. There's also virtual options if you're not comfortable traveling quite yet. So there's hybrid options, virtual options, and more. And we'll also have a session there that talks more about digital equity. If this is the 101 version, that will be the 102 version. And there'll be lots of other great opportunities as well.
Thanks so much, Caroline. And just as a note to follow up what Caroline just said, we are likely to have a joint webinar in early 2022 with our friends at the Coalition for Adult Basic Education, or COABE. We're probably going to do one with our friends at the American Library Association and the Public Library Association. If you think we should host a joint webinar with you, you should be in touch. And the last slide here does have Caroline's and my contact information. I want to lift up a couple questions I saw in the chat. The first question is, do we expect the federal government to issue guidance to states with more detail about what's expected in the digital equity plan? The short answer is yes. But also, I really do encourage you to go read the legislation itself. It's not crazy long, it's not crazy wordy, and it does pretty clearly spell out what Congress is expecting will be included in these digital equity plans. And I think it gives you a really nice jump start on what we're likely to see in more detail from federal agencies in the months to come. I also saw some questions in the chat about timeline. So we're not the federal agency in charge of administering this money. There are different factors that are driving their calendar, including when things can be published in the Federal Register, when apportionment happens, and a whole bunch of other kind of big moving pieces that dictate when they'll be able to release requests for comment. And then once they get the responses to the requests for comment, when they'll be able to release a notice of funding opportunity. So I would encourage you to make sure to attend the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, the NTIA, public listening sessions about the Digital Equity Act if you want to stay in the loop for the exact timing. And again, make sure to join both the NSC listserv or mailing list rather, and the National Digital Inclusion Alliance listserv, which again, I did link on an earlier slide, so that should be easy to spot. The legislation is linked on an earlier slide, and so I did see a request for the link to that in the chat. When you get the slides, you'll be able to click on that and just read it. There's a question here about digital work and changes more broadly around climate change. The short answer is yes, there are smart people working on this, but we are not qualified to comment on that question. So I absolutely encourage you to dig into that in conversation with folks who are working on digital inclusion with a kind of green lens. But I would be foolish to suggest to you that I am the person to answer that question. Caroline, in the last couple of minutes here, is there anything that you want to add that has come up as a common question that you're hearing from the field or that you spotted in the chat that you wanted to lift up?
I don't think so. I think we were able to cover everything. We're right there.
Okay, and I did see a question in the chat about the summit. The Skills Summit is our annual event. It is this year, well, 2022, February 15th through the 17th. It is in Washington, D.C., but as Caroline mentioned, we have some hybrid virtual options if you're not able to travel at this point. And if you would like to know more, we have linked that orange link in the slide here. Gives you a link directly to the summit website. You can see the agenda. If you want to get an extended early bird rate, you can email Caroline or me after the webinar, and we can give you a link to register with a decreased early bird rate. I want to be respectful of time here. We promised you that we were only going to take 30 minutes out of your day. So I just want to flag for you our last slide here has our contact information. You will get this in your email when you get the slides, and we do encourage you to reach out. Tell us about really cool stuff you're doing on the ground. Ask us questions you're hearing and seeing. And please make sure that you share this information with any peers or colleagues you have who weren't able to make it today. We really want to make sure that as broad an audience as possible is getting this information. Thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time. Have a wonderful, peaceful, and safe holiday season. Take care.